Our ancient witness for today is taken from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, verses 1 through 8 and 13 through 20. Again, Jesus began to teach beside the sea. Such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat on the sea and sat there, while the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. Jesus began to teach them, saying many things in parables. And in his teaching, he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as that one sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into the good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And then Jesus said to them, "Do you not understand this parable? Then how will you understand all of the parables? The sower sows the word. These are the ones on the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. And these are the ones sown on rocky ground. When they hear the word, they immediately receive it with joy, but they have no root and endure only for a little while. Then when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. And others are those sown among the thorns. These are the ones who hear the word, but the cares of the age and the lure of wealth and the desire for other things come in and choke the word, and it yields nothing. And these are the ones sown on the good soil. They hear the word and accept it and bear fruit, 30 and 60 and 100-fold." Here ends the reading.
Good morning, everybody. It's so great to see all of you. Before I start, I wanted to take a moment of personal privilege and say that today we're going to be talking about what sustains us when things get hard. And for me, two of the big things that sustain me besides this church are music and worship and Camp and Sitson. So I want to say a huge thank you to Sam for these past couple weeks of music. It's just been wonderful. And to Kathy, who's been playing the music here as long as I can remember and who arranged the garden song accompaniment today. So, I love getting to work with Kathy. And thank you to Mike and Isaiah and all of you who are going up to camp in a couple weeks for continuing to support a place that's been really, really important for me and my spiritual growth and for a lot of young people in this conference, and especially a lot of queer youth in this conference. It's been a really important safe space for a lot of us. So that's all my big thank yous for today. So around this time 2 years ago, my mom was standing up here and she was preaching and talking about the very beginnings of her efforts to establish a native plant garden around my childhood home. When she started looking at our yard to do this project, she realized that the soil was hard, full of clay, could barely break it with a shovel, and it was not very conducive to new life. So her garden planting project actually began with the arduous process of laying down layers and layers of cardboard and literally tons, or maybe not tons, hundreds of pounds of bark chips to kill the weeds underneath and build up new layers of healthy, nutrient-rich soil. I got a front row view to each step of this process, and I'll be honest, this first part was not visually stunning. It mostly looked like our yard was covered in bark chips and dirt. But my mom had a vision, as she often does, and she persisted. After the soil was established, and she told you all here about her excitement as earthworms returned to her soil, my mom started planting native plant seeds and starts, which are little tiny green sprouts like this big in a long, skinny plastic container. It's almost like a test tube or something. And as my mom has gone about locating and collecting native plant starts, I've had the privilege of accompanying her and learning a lot more about native Palouse plants myself. What I learned on these trips to visit native plant mentors around the Palouse is this. At one point, the Palouse was almost entirely covered in its own unique, super localized prairie ecosystem. Our rolling hills were covered with tall, flowing native grasses interspersed with pops of color from native flowers like sunny yellow cinquefoil, deep plum purple penstemon, fiery red paintbrush, delicate pink showy milkweed, and bright blue-purple camas. Thickets of native shrubs and bushes, including things that are still our favorites like huckleberries and serviceberries, lined our riverbanks and creeks. And pollinators like migrating monarch butterflies and hundreds, if not thousands, of species of local mason bees enjoyed these native plants as well. The human communities who have lived here since time immemorial, the Palouse, Cayuse, Nimipu, and other indigenous peoples use these plants for food, weaving, shelter, medicine, and so much more. But as European Americans colonized our region, native Palouse prairie made way for commercial, agriculture, and housing development. Today, less than 1% of this original, amazing Palouse prairie habitat remains. So, local native plant enthusiasts like my mom have taken on the task of replanting native plants, while local organizations like Palouse Conservation District, Palouse Clearwater Environmental Institute, and the Palouse Land Trust are seeing to it that what little original prairie exists is protected. Although the loss of the Palouse prairie is devastating, it's also kind of miraculous to me that there are these bits of prairie that have persisted. These are mostly these like tiny little remnants that are often in old cemeteries or on the sides of hills that are too steep for a combine to go over, so farmers can't plant them. And the thing about these plants is that they are perfectly suited for our environment. And even though they take a while to establish, they really want to be here. They don't require a ton of water. They're pollinated easily by local butterflies and bees. And planting just a couple of these plants will almost inevitably beget more plants because they have seeds that are blown by the wind so that they scatter and their seeds find elsewhere to land. Our gospel reading today tells us the story of another gardener or farmer embarking on their own journey of sorts, sowing seeds and waiting to see whether their planting will be successful. Now, like many of you, I'm sure I've heard this story countless times and I could tell you the general shape of it. But this time when I read through the story, the part that really stuck out to me was this. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched since it had no root, and it withered away. I can't help hearing this section about the sower's excitement, seeing the very first plants poke their heads above ground. And then I imagine her disappointment when these same first plants start to wither and die. Maybe she's even confused. Why did these plants, which seemed so successful and hardy at first, die so quickly, while other plants stayed smaller or took longer to grow, but seemed to be doing okay? Maybe she's even feeling frustrated, like her time and talents have been wasted on these seeds. Now, in the native Palouse plant world, there's a saying, first year creep, second year sleep, third year leap. The first year of my mom's big native plant project, After the Soil, involved a lot of hours of her hauling buckets of water to her garden, weeding in the hot summer sun, and tending patiently to these teeny tiny, I can't emphasize how tiny these little sprouts are at first. And native plant mentors told us that after the first year, some of these plants that were established would live, a lot would probably die, but either way, no more watering would be required. Once these plants got established, they'd survive only off water that they absorbed from the soil. We were also warned that the second summer after they're planted, native plants often don't come up at all. It can seem like all the hard work that you've put into carefully tending and watering plants was for naught. But then the next year, or even the year after that, you go outside one day in the spring and bam, there is the sunshiny face of an arrowleaf balsam root greeting you, or a friendly purple Jessica's aster. Because the thing is that these plants have a secret. While they disappear above ground, they're not stagnant or dormant. These little plants are hard at work below the ground, dedicating all their energy into growing these long, hardy root systems. The roots of native flowers can reach down 3 or 4 feet into the soil. So like this big of a plant, this big of a root. Roots intermingle with their neighbors and they form complex networks. After a few years, it's almost impossible to uproot a lot of native plants, especially if you're hoping to transplant them. These plants are anchored in their soil and within their community. The roots also allow the plants to reach down deep into the soil where they can find moisture and nutrients even during drought conditions above ground. The extended initial growing period of native plants, which can feel very frustrating and hard to wait patiently through, allows them to produce the deep roots that allow them to remain resilient to whatever nature or other human beings throw their way. Now, we've been talking about a couple of parables recently in church, and each of Jesus's parables is also a story that has something to tell us about God's vision for our collective future. Through these short stories, Jesus tells us about some snippet of how the kingdom of God will be, or how we can bring about this ideal future, this kingdom, where all beings live in love and care and feel the love and care of God. In other words, these stories tell us something about how we can transform our world, which is currently full of sin, corruption, greed, racism, inequality, environmental destruction, into a world where love and justice reign and where all living beings have what they need to survive and thrive. Now, if I'm honest, right now, the promised kingdom that we hear about in these parables feels further away than ever in my lifetime. With each new day comes new news of death, destruction, and injustice here in the US and abroad, often wrought by our own government and funded by our tax dollars. But we are also seeing a new outpouring of energy, resisting and speaking up against this injustice. Communities are coming together to show solidarity with our marginalized neighbors and demand equal treatment and dignity for all people. It seems to me that the fruits of love and justice that Jesus foreshadows in his parables are starting to spring up in our midst. The actions that we're seeing, these fruits, have been impressive and much needed in tough times. The rallies and protests in support of immigrants, reproductive rights, and Palestinian self-determination that have happened in the last year or two have given me the hope and strength I need to move through our current moment. In the same way, the outpouring of material support that came through immediately after the Palisades wildfire in California, or that we see often after other so-called quote-unquote natural climate disasters, ensure that people can simply survive these disasters and live to see another day. But in the parable of the sower, Jesus warns us that these immediate bursts of energy, these first fruits, might be temporary or might not be enough to bring the kingdom. These first fruits last only until our personal difficulties overshadow our altruism, or until we are fired, arrested, deported, or lose important relationships when we speak out about our beliefs. And when these bursts of energy dissipate, our world often goes back to business as usual, the business of perpetuating violence and inequality. These initial actions have impressive fruits, but they have shallow roots, and they're not enough to create the kind of long-term systemic transformation we need to bring about a different world. Jesus tells us that we need to build up nutrient-rich community, nutrient-rich soil, and spend our energy growing our own deep roots to ensure that our movements for change are sustainable and far-reaching. Now, the thing that organizers might not tell you about this soil-building, root-growing work is that it's slow-going, and it's not always the most gratifying. The work is hard, and it's not always the thing that you can point to or show your friends or skeptical observers and say, see, look at this cool thing I'm doing. This work often goes unnoticed and unthanked. Other people might even feel frustrated and tell you that you're not doing enough when you're not producing large, externally visible outcomes. The author and movement scholar Dean Spade explores this type of root-building work in his book, Mutual Aid. This book explores how the kinds of hands-on charity work that support our neighbors and keep people alive can be part of a larger movement for systemic change. The type of work he's talking about is things like delivering meals to a new mom, raking an elderly neighbor's leaves, pooling resources to buy N95 masks for disabled folks, or stocking a local food pantry to help our hungry neighbors. Spade says that, quote, "We are used to living in a society that ignores ordinary caring labor, much of which, by the way, is seen as women's work, like cooking and cleaning and conflict mediation, while celebrating only the final outward-looking evidence of production. The big protest march, the finalized legislation, the release of someone from prison, or the media coverage. We have not been taught to notice or care about how things went along the way," end quote. And yet, it's precisely this type of everyday, ordinary care work that sustains our movements for the long haul. This work gives people energy and keeps people coming back when short-term victories end, when our big campaigns lose, and when our companions or even ourselves experience repression and real-world consequences for speaking out. Now, I think that this type of deep care work is one of the places where faith communities in general, and our church specifically, shine. I hope that you all do not take it for granted that you're sitting among a community who you know loves you and will help take care of you when life gets hard. These types of life of the church activities nourish our collective soil and give us energy to grow our roots so that we can keep doing the difficult work of loudly, publicly demanding justice and an end to oppression and violence. Even simple things like opening the doors of the church to community groups like Queer Quest or Police for Palestine so that we have a warm, safe, and welcoming place to gather contribute enormously to the larger work of collective justice. I know that for me, knowing that Police for Palestine has had a consistent space to gather for the last year has allowed us to turn our energy and brain space to organizing actions that educate our community and demonstrate solidarity with people in Palestine. This type of support, carried out lovingly by a community that practices what it preaches, helps us to, quote, "build the world we want and become the kind of people who could live in such a world together," as Dean Spade puts it. Now, when I started thinking about the biblical parable of the sower a couple weeks ago, I also naturally thought about Octavia Butler's novel of the same name. This book has already been top of mind for me and for many other activists on the left because of how it speaks to our current reality. The book tells the story of the teenager Lauren Olamina, who recounts her life in a near-future Los Angeles. In her Los Angeles, the city is violent and unstable. Upper-middle-class families like Lauren survive by living in gated and armed communities. Gun violence is a constant threat. Groceries and gasoline are unaffordable for even formerly comfortable families, especially with sky-high unemployment rates, and theft to meet basic survival needs is rampant. Water is scarce, and selling drinkable water is highly lucrative. Fires that destroy blocks of houses at a time are nearly a weekly occurrence, and these fires are made worse by climate change-driven drought and high temperatures. Amidst these crises and chaos, communities turn inward, protecting themselves and blaming other people for the current state of the country, especially racial or other religious groups. Many people say, as the book goes on, that the solution is to return to a patriarchal, white, Christian America. Meanwhile, it seems that the very wealthy are impacted by almost none of this. They continue to live their lives as usual, away from the rest of us, using their wealth to access anything they could ever need or want. Now, this novel and the LA that it describes must have seemed like an unimaginable future to many readers when it was published in 1993. But the events of the novel began in the year 2024, and many elements of the story feel eerily prescient today. But it's important to note that the Parable of the Sower novel is not just a depressing apocalypse narrative about how bad things might get. Instead, this book tells the story of a young woman intent on her survival and her community's, who finds new ways of meeting her family's needs and building a new community around her. As she tells the story of her community, Lauren also shares her own philosophy, which guides her actions throughout the book. She tells us that, above all, the most important thing to recognize is that change is inevitable. We can count on nothing in this world except for that, however things are going now, things will change. This might seem foreboding to some who are living comfortably, whose needs are met, or who are in dominant positions in society. But for those of us who have unmet needs or who face oppressive social systems, Lauren's view is also a promise. As entrenched as our current system seems and as intractable as our circumstances might appear, they can and perhaps will change eventually. Lauren warns us that any change may bear seeds of benefit, seek them out. Any change may bear seeds of harm, beware. Although we can't control the future or predict it, we can shape the inevitable change that will come through careful planning and forethought about how we want the future to look. The parable of the sower is not a prophecy, even though right now it kind of feels like it is sometimes. But in the novel, Butler does not doom America to a future of violence and death and destruction. Instead, she predicts how the world might look if we continue on our current path, fueled by greed, prejudice, and resistance to transformation. But she also predicts the ways that we might resist this. Butler tells us that even if we can't control our future outcomes, it's up to us to act now in ways that both meet the immediate needs of our communities and set us on a path towards collective liberation. In the parable of the sower and in all of his stories, Jesus also tells us that a different world is possible. The kingdom of God is a promise of a world in which all living beings live in dignity and harmony and abundance. We have the choice to prepare for adversity and for this coming kingdom now by building up our communities and tending to our neighbors so that we can harness moments of flux when they come, survive adversity, and set ourselves on the path towards the kingdom that God promises. We are all given the same seed, and honestly, right now, it feels like we are standing on some pretty rocky, barren, clay-filled soil. But we know that we can change the soil. We know that there's so much right now that we can do as a community to build our soil and grow our collective roots. It's probably going to be hard work, backbreaking, thankless at times, but at other times it will be wonderful and lovely. And we know, because we are promised by Jesus and by modern day prophets like Octavia Butler, that if we work together, we can do what needs to be done. After all, as Adrienne Marie Brown reminds us in her own reflection on the parable of the sower, The seed that is sown is not the end of the story, but only the beginning. Amen.